Good evening, church. I love it. I'm glad you could be here tonight. And I know you're saying, as you look up on the screen what the topic tonight, and you're saying to yourself, wasn't it just Easter this morning? Wasn't it bunny rabbits and Easter eggs and happiness? That's right, it is. Absolutely it is. I didn't plan it in particular this way. It just kind of worked out. But as you know, we're going through a series on discussion group topics throughout this particular quarter where we've invited you to ask questions, things that you might have wondered about in the Bible. And maybe you haven't said it too much out loud and you haven't had a chance to think about it and study it. And you're like, I really wish we would cover that topic. And I really appreciate so many of the questions that you have submitted so far, the ones I've still been getting. And I do want to encourage you, if you still have a question or a thought, it could be a theological question that you had. It could be just something you've always wondered about God and the Bible and the way that we live today. We're going to look for Bible answers. And I would encourage you to continue sending those questions in. They've been very helpful. And I've gotten feedback from many people who said, I didn't ask that question, but I'm so glad someone did. And so you might be a blessing to someone if you do the same thing. Well, tonight we had several people ask regarding this particular topic. Demon possession, darkness, things of a spiritual nature. And before we dive into it, I would just like to remind you something that Rodney pointed out in his prayer. Before we get into it and you're like, man, this is really scary for me. And it is for some people. It really is. This is really terrifying for me. I want you to remember first and foremost, our God is almighty. Our God is all powerful, and there is none greater. None greater. And that should give you a tremendous amount of comfort. I want to remind you that if you fill your life up with God, you don't give much room for anything else. And so it is a question of priority and is a question of, how we shape our lives. But with the topic of demon possession and things of a dark sense and the occult and whatnot, we're going to look for Bible answers. That's an important thing to point out at the beginning. At the beginning. Because you have probably encountered some story or some folklore or some movie or thing that's kind of like, man, is that what it's really like? And I get that. Tarot cards, that's adjacent to it, very popular today. You can find any number of tarot cards available on various websites, or people who would give you a reading and use the powers of divination to tell you what your future is going to be. That's a very real thing that exists today. And if you're saying, yeah, I didn't know that, that's okay. Stay away from it. Waste of time. Ouija boards, maybe at some point you said, oh, I remember us joking around with that, and we put our hands on there, and I didn't move it, but somebody did. Milton Bradley at one point even released it as a toy that you could buy. I will tell you that some years ago, someone local, I'll not name names, when they were teenagers, said, get me one, because I was going to New Orleans. I said, I will not. And they said, no, a real one, made of wood, like proper. And I was like, no. Instead, I went around to the citizens of New Orleans and recorded a video saying, this young guy up in Evansville wants a Ouija board. Will you tell him why he shouldn't have one? They jumped all over it. Young man, let me tell you now in these videos, don't mess with it. And that was pretty fascinating. Wise words, don't mess with it. Even in our minds and our concepts, we get the idea of demons and darkness being these absolutely horrifying things that are kind of vague, off in the distance, but right next to us, and maybe it's going to get us at some point. Maybe there are secret meetings of people doing weird things, and it's going to disrupt our lives and tear us apart. Maybe something's going to get us, a bump in the night. Maybe. The point of discussing this from a biblical perspective is to tell you, you don't have to worry about such things if you follow God and if you protect yourself. But we do want to establish that, yes, these things do permeate popular culture. That poster is actually from the original Exorcist. I was telling the guys upstairs, I didn't know it came out on December the 25th. That's funny and awful. And that movie terrified people because they don't really understand. And when they see the things in that movie, they're like, that's so horrifying. And even today it holds up. But even modern movies like Sinister or Late Night with the Devil, and there's so many more that exist, they kind of feed our minds of what this is really about. But I'm telling you, don't go to those as your source. That's movies. The movies aren't reality. The Bible is reality. So we want a biblical source. Even in other storytellers like David Lynch, it's not the horrifying things. I mean, that's all scary stuff there. David Lynch's idea was that there's always something seedy in the underbelly of the safest places. You remember Twin Peaks. It was horrifying what was underneath. But nonetheless, what does the Bible say? That's all that really matters in this. All the mythologies, all the made-up stuff, no matter what old books you've read, grimoires and knowledgeable people or whatnot, irrelevant. What does the Bible say, first and foremost? Go to Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 13. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 13, I think, is a fine place to start. This is Paul writing to the church in Ephesus. That's important to remember at the beginning. Paul writing to the church in Ephesus. Now, if you recall a few Sundays ago, we talked about Paul and the work he was doing in the city in Ephesus in Acts chapter 19. That's a great bit of information leading into this. And you're like, yeah, I remember you kind of talking about it, a little fuzzy. We'll circle back to it. But right now in Ephesians chapter 6, he's writing to the church in Ephesus, and he's given them a lot of great instructions. I mean, the 6 chapters of Ephesians is fantastic. Chapter 1 reminding us the authority of Jesus as the head of the church, really talking about unity in chapter 4, that we were created for good works in chapter. I mean, it's just a fantastic book. But chapter 6, verses 10 through 13, dials in on our topic for tonight. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord. That's encouraging. Be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. It's a good reminder. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we do not wrestle, listen to this part, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Now, you know the following passage is going to talk about the various parts of the armor of God, and with good reason. Sometimes we're guilty of taking this passage and relegating it to little kids. And you've probably seen the little sets of armor, copies of Roman armor, and it's cute, they run around, and it's generally where that gets taught. And that's fine, it's good. That's not who he's writing to. He's writing to adults. And it's not a game that he's talking about. He's wanting them to understand the reality of existence. We are in a spiritual warfare. It's easy to set that aside and pretend that's not the thing that's really going on around us and the decisions that we make and the way we live. And I get it because, hey man, I just want to pay my bills. I just want to feed my family. I just want to go on vacation. I just want to not think about those kind of things because some of it's really scary. Spiritual warfare, what is that? What is that? He's talking about the reality of it. And as Christians, on one hand, we know God exists. We know angels exist. But sometimes we'll talk about the devil in a metaphorical sense or an allegorical sense or demons as something probably not. But not here. They're real. He's talking about them in real ways. And he's talking about how you can stand against them and how you stand up for God and how to exist in such a reality. But you notice what he didn't say. Cower, run away, go to bed terrified, cry yourself to sleep. That's not anywhere in this at all. It is take it serious. And he does talk about it in terms of warfare. But understand this is spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare. That's the enemy. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. So yeah, he's going to go talk about putting on a shield of faith, a sword of the Spirit. And these are very real things that he's wanting people to equip themselves to stand. Not to run, not to hide, not to cower, but to stand. Because we follow the one true God. And that's why he opened with, finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Well, as I said, he's writing to the church in Ephesus. In Acts chapter 19, do you remember the things that he encountered there? It brings to light why he would write this passage. In Acts chapter 19, if you want to flip over and just look at the main chunks of that, there was a lot of spiritual warfare that was taking place at this particular time, wasn't there? Do you remember in Acts chapter 19, verses 11 and 12, it talked about the fact that people were going there for healing, people were looking for solutions, so much so that he was working unusual miracles. Now, God worked unusual miracles by the hands of Paul. Verse 12, so that even the handkerchiefs or aprons were brought from his body to the sick, and the diseases left them, and evil spirits went out of them. This was something he was contending with. You might remember verses 13 through 17 that there were these itinerant Jewish exorcists, and they were trying to cast out a demon by powers they didn't even believe in. They didn't believe in Jesus. And that those evil spirits responded in kind and overtook them and tormented them and chased them away. You remember in verse 19, in which the people that had listened to the message of God and turned to God repented of their practices in the occult, and they burned all those books, 50,000 silver pieces worth, showing a great victory in God. And you even remember the riot. We get caught up in the idea of the riot in the people, but that was all centered around the economics of pagan worship, of things in opposition to God, to the great temple of Artemis or Diana. He's in the midst of spiritual warfare very directly. And in a way that we can go, okay, yeah, I can see that, and I can frame that with false idols, and I can frame that with these exorcists going around, and that's a very different reality than we live in, David, isn't it? Is it? Our idols just have different names. There's people that still go around claiming to do these exorcisms and such. I had hoped to show a video tonight, but the software that allowed me to download it crashed. Maybe that's divine intervention, and you're like, great, my children don't need to see that. Maybe. But yeah, that stuff still happens today. And the fact is, people are still suffering and oppressed because evil is afoot. But there's some takeaways from this. Those demons in the darkness that existed in Ephesus at that time, they were subject to the power of God. They had no authority or power greater than God. Did you catch the fact that through the power of God, even a handkerchief or an apron that had been with Paul was enough, and these demons had to flee, the evil spirits had to flee. They were subject to the power of God. Did you notice also that they oppressed people? What they did was very real in terms of oppressing people, and they troubled lives. That was real. However, God provided a solution, whether it was by miraculous powers or through the teaching of the gospel. God provided a solution. People were not left incapable, and they were given relief from the oppression. The third thing to remember, and I think this is so important for Christians today, we might be tempted to flee in such a circumstance. We might be tempted to say it's too much and run away. We might be tempted to say that's foolishness that Paul would even stand in such a circumstance. And yet Paul the apostle did stand in such a circumstance. And he stood for God, and he stood equipped with the whole armor of God, and he stood to help people. He did not cower. He did not run. He did not abandon. And no matter how dark it got or how confusing it might have been, and even in the face of a riot, he was willing to go out in the midst of that. And we should be reminded that in spiritual warfare, we do not back down. Not if we believe in the one true God and his almighty power. The message of Ephesians 6, it's no children's game. But if we're going to participate, we need to know God's game plan for facing that. And part of that is understanding the reality that these things are real. Now, how do they function today? Well, that's the real question, isn't it? How do they function today? Is it the same? Is it exactly the same? Is it similar? Well, they are real, and they do have power, and they do have influence. Even in the Bible, we can see that those demons, what are they? It doesn't really say a lot. This is the honest statement. It's kind of vague. Where they came from, Don't really know. There's a lot of myths to that, and you've probably heard some and might discuss it tonight. Are they fallen angels? Maybe. Are they the souls of the wicked dead? Maybe. Alexander Campbell taught that. There's all kinds of other theories, and those are fine. They're good to talk about over dinner if that's your thing. I'm more interested in exactly what the Bible says. And the Bible doesn't give us a lot of explanation, so we don't have the right to start making things up. But what we do know, well, Jesus did use the idea of demons interchangeably with evil spirits. In Matthew 8:16, it writes, when the evening had come, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed. And he cast out the spirits with a word, and he healed all who were sick. So they're not physical, they're spirits. There's many spirits in the Bible. Angels are spirits. God is spirit. Satan is a spirit. Ephesians 2:1-2. So they're of that realm. And they have some measure of influence. In fact, they did have some measure of power, didn't they? 1 Timothy 1:1, perhaps really relevant for us today, reminds us that the kind of power they had was through their influence and false teachings that they were able to do. Paul warns Timothy, now the Spirit expressly says that in latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons. 1 John chapter 4 also reminds us, test the spirits. Test the spirits. So they did have the power to deceive and tempt us to believe a lie. Then and even now it happens all the time. Matthew chapter 12 verse 32, they had power to oppress and they brought blindness to people. Chapter 9 verse 32, they caused people to become mute. So we know that about them. However, we do know that they didn't have ultimate power. They didn't have ultimate power. They had limitations. And that's another important thing we talk about as we go into it tonight. We're going to have time for discussion, I promise, but just some lead-in things. They didn't have ultimate power. For example, in Mark chapter 1, there was a man that was oppressed by an evil spirit in a synagogue. And he came before Jesus and cried out, saying, let us alone. What have we to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Did you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Well, they have intelligence, and they have the ability to communicate, through a human at least. But Jesus told him to be quiet. Can you imagine? Jesus said, be quiet. Come out of him. He came out of him. He had no authority over Jesus, no ability to rebel against Jesus. He couldn't even put up a fight against Jesus. Jesus said, be quiet and come out of him. They're limited. They're limited. And he did oppress that man, but Jesus brought relief. They do have intelligence. They do have power. But Jesus was the answer. Even if you think about the time when Satan himself tempted Jesus, I think this is important to remember. How did Jesus defeat him? If you remember that story in Matthew chapter 4, it wasn't through miraculous powers. Jesus used the same thing that we can use today. He quoted the scriptures. He leaned into the power of God's word spoken in truth. And that was enough. Peter reminds us if we resist the devil, he will flee from us. So there are limitations. Be mindful of that. Be mindful of the power of Jesus. And I use this image on purpose because I love the fact that Jesus would come to save even the lamb. That's you, that's me. And he would guide us in a way, and he's always going to be greater in that sense. And that's an important thing to remember as we talk about this topic. I hope what you're getting from this over and over and over again is do not be afraid. Do not discount the reality of it, but do not be afraid. You were meant to stand. You were meant to engage in spiritual warfare. You were meant for victory through Jesus. Don't ignore that part of it. Not at all. But I also love this passage in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 27. Give no opportunity to the devil. If you read that passage and the sections around it, right before it is, he says, be angry and sin not. He also talks about lying and several other sins. And that is how we open the door for these things to occupy space in our lives, their influence. When we give in to ungodliness, we crack that door open just a little bit. And the more skilled we get with ungodliness, and the more that we pursue divinations and things of the occult and spiritual nature, we give it presence and invitation into our lives. And the more we allow that to happen, it becomes a habit. well, it starts to consume our lives, doesn't it? We make decisions, and it becomes normal. On the flip side, if you remember Revelation chapter 3, verse 20, Jesus says he's at the door, and he's knocking, and he wants to come into our lives. Our choice is to give him space as well. And that's absolutely what we need to do. The choice is up to us. They have no absolute control over you. Even these people that were demon-possessed in the New Testament, the demons didn't stop them from going to Jesus. Not just the man in the synagogue, but even the man in the cemetery possessed by Legion. He still went to Jesus, and Jesus provided a solution. That's what we're going to discuss tonight. I hope you have got some questions for this, and I know that some of you are going to like, well, I heard you, but man, did you mean that? Yeah. I want Bible answers. I want Bible solutions, and that's where we're going to hover in this tonight. I know there's a lot of legends and myths and movies and such about it, and that's fine. They have their place, but our place is in the Scripture, and we want to stick with that. Tonight, as we conclude, as we get ready for our discussion groups, we want to offer the invitation. It may be that you've spent time in darkness in these things and you want to cast it aside. It may be that you've had a moment where you recognize the life that those people in Ephesus had, and you said, yeah, I know exactly what they're talking about. Maybe you got caught up in lying or in anger and those things you talked about in Ephesians 4. Maybe you let it rain deep in your heart and you're like, I need to be free. God's given you free will. And God's given you promises. And God, as we said this morning, has given you hope through the resurrection of Jesus. He's given you a solution. Tonight, you can respond to that solution and have salvation. You can have freedom. You can know that these powers of darkness and spiritual warfare and such will not have victory over your life if you choose faithfulness in Jesus. Do that boldly. Do it with confidence. There's a way we can help you in that tonight. Let us know as we stand and as we sing.